Okay, no need for mute. But there was a bit of a mix-up. There is an addended study sheet today with the sources that you saw, but with a few more, and which I managed to come across. This. So I'm going to project it on the screen today, unlike what we usually do. But before we begin looking at the rabbinic or the post-biblical material, I do want to remind everybody, if you had a chance to have the other sheet, the original two sheets, the chapters 4 and 5, it'll be good to be able to compare it, because if you remember, and we're concentrating now on Devorah and Yael. That's our concentration. We'll have a little bit of post-biblical traditions about Devorah herself, who you can imagine being a major character, was challenging for some of the more misogynistic or gender biased rabbis in the past in the Talmud, etc. But then we're going to focus probably even a little bit more on Yael. And you remember when it came to Yael, there was a kind of a different account of what happened. Whether Sisera just kind of fell asleep after getting the milk that she fed him, or okay, I don't know what's going on here. I think Madalena.
Yes.
Okay, we seem to have a problem with who's on the screen right now. So let's just go to gallery. Let's keep it at gallery today. Well, no, I don't know. Okay, I'm gonna share the screen in just a second, but we're getting somebody else's picture there. When it comes to Yael, just remember the details, and if you have the other text to refer to, that would be good as well. And this is today's session is devoted to post-biblical embellishments of the story, hence the title, in retrospect. In other words, how was this? How were these two versions, these two traditions of the story looked back upon in later times? And we're only going to go as far as rabbinic times, or maybe 10th century or so, or maybe even 13th, 14th century, but with one comment. But of course, we could go on to today as well, as we always do, and there'll be time for that hopefully at the end. Okay, so screen sharing time. Okay, everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So our first, and I arranged them in chronological order, which is not necessarily the best pedagogical way. We're going to be bouncing between different parts of the story. But right now we start with Pseudofilo, a really interesting source. First century of the Common Era, right around 2000 something years ago. Was originally attributed by somebody to Philo of Alexandria. It's not Philo at all, hence the title Pseudophilo. It's in what we call pseudoepigrapha. It's not the apocryphal literature, it's beyond that. In other words, it was considered to be sacred literature in certain circles, but it's an ancient Jewish document. That's what's important for our purpose. Translated, I think this version was translated from the Latin. I don't remember exactly though. But why don't we go ahead and if I can ask Mariah to read this from Pseudophilo 33, and have in mind as she's reading what the differences might be between this and the biblical text. Go ahead.
Now Yael took a stake in her left hand and approached him, saying, "If God will work this sign with me, I know that Sisera will fall into my hands. Behold, I will throw him down on the ground from the bed on which he sleeps, and if he does not feel it, I know that he has been handed over." And Yael took Sisera and pushed him onto the ground from the bed, but he did not feel it because he was very groggy. And Yael said, "Strengthen in me today, Lord, my arm on account of you and your people and those who hope in you." And Yael took the stake and put it on his temple and struck it with a hammer. And while he was dying, Sisera said to Yael, "Behold, pain has taken hold of me, Yael, and I die like a woman." And Yael said to him, "Go boast before your father in hell, and tell him that you have fallen into the hands of a woman.
To this, we would say in Israel, "Hopa, hopa!" Very, very. What an answer, huh? What an answer!
Wow.
A pretty emboldened, courageous woman, given the times of 2,000 years ago. Looking back on 1,500 years before that, yeah, may you rot in hell, you dirty bastard. All the things that we see in TV and movies, and here it is. You saw it first in Pseudofilo, 2,000 years ago. I like the idea that, oh no, I'm going to die like a woman in pain, which is an interesting, I would imagine, somehow is connected, it's connected to the fact that so many women died in childbirth, right? When you think of certainly young women dying, they're dying in childbirth. And so they're dying in pain. So an interesting kind of a spin on this. The other part of this is that, you know what? I'm not sure I can get away with this, but I'll push him onto the ground. If he sleeps soundly, that I can get away with it. It's kind of this testing. So really dramatizes something even more than it already is in the original. So any comments or questions would people like to say about this? Number one.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is it a little misogynistic in that, or maybe I'm reading into it from 20th century view, where Yael says to him, boast before your father in hell and tell him that you've fallen into the hands of a woman, that it is for a warrior like Sisera, it is worse to die at the hand of a woman than to be killed in battle, say.
Absolutely. I don't know if I would call this misogynistic. Certainly, in our times, I'm not even sure it would be sexist, certainly. But is it hatred of women to say that?
No, I wouldn't say it was. No, I wouldn't say it was hatred.
Yeah, that's kind of misogynism in my mind means hatred.
Oh.
But in any case, though, it echoes what was said in the original story. Remember what Dvorah said to Barak? Sure, I'll come with you, but remember, in the annals of history, if we're victorious, the victory is not going to go to you, the man. It's going to go to a woman. And of course, we understood Dvorah saying to me, Dvorah, and that feels like part of the story because she does that epic poem in the second chapter as well, in chapter 5. But also, that's kind of the whole pointa of this story, that the powerful men are bowing to the will, are falling at the feet of these women. And in both cases, it's Barak in many ways humbled before Dvorah, and it's Sisera certainly humbled before Yael.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any meaning in her using her left hand?
Yeah, in the look in the Tanakh. Let me get mine. I should have had it out. Hold on, just a second.
Wouldn't that just be because she's right-handed and had the hammer in her right hand?
Yeah, well, it's kind of based on the way that the verse is written. Let me just open it up to, if anybody has it in front of you from previous to the last two. Let's see, we're in chapter 4, Judges 4. So in 4:21, then Yael, the son of Hever, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. When he was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove his pin through his temple, and it went down to the ground. Thus he died. That's the English translation. But if you look in the Hebrew, Vatikach Yael eshet Hever, and Yael, the husband, the wife of Hever, et yated ha'ohel. Oh, that's why I don't see. And she put it in her hand. Okay, that's why I don't remember. It's not here. It's not in the narrative. It's in the poem. So if you look at the poem, Verse 24, I'm reading this section on Yael. Most blessed of women be Yael, wife of Hever the Kini, most blessed of women in tents. Right? So you see the parallelism, right? Most blessed of women. He asked her for water, she offered milk. In a princely bowl, she brought him curds, which is soured milk, which is going to come up later on, I think. Her left hand reached for the tent pin, her right for the workman's hammer. So it's spelled out, and so that's why it's mentioned here, Sasha. It's spelled out in the poem about it. And yeah, Richard, you're right. On one hand, that's how it works. You need to use two hands to do something like this. On the other hand, and no pun intended, in the poetic account, it seems more poetic, a parallelism in his right hand. Yes, okay, all right. I hope that explains it. Explains it? Okay. Something else, anybody? Okay. So, Susie Ordner, would you like to read from Josephus? So, if Pseudophilo is a paraphrase, it's really one of the earliest, if not the earliest, one of the earliest, not the earliest, paraphrase of the biblical story, the biblical story retold, which we see a lot in the Targum, in the Aramaic translations. We see it in Midrash Tanchuma later on. We see it in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Tanchuma are just sections. At least I found in my own research of Tanchuma, but Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, which is 7th, 8th century, earliest, there's a lot of rewriting of the biblical story there. And so you've got that here as well. Josephus does that, but he does it in the role of the historian. So I brought a larger section from here. It's not to say that Pseudophilo doesn't deal with some of these things, but you can feel sometimes Josephus, who was a military man who became a historian in Rome, writing to remind everybody, this is in Antiquities, it should say Antiquities of the Jews. He's writing for the Greek reading speaking population of Rome. He's writing in Koine Greek, the popular form of Greek, not classical Greek like Homer, the same Greek that's the New Testament and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible are in. Go ahead, Susie, number 2.
So the battle began, and when they were come to a close fight, there came down from heaven a great storm with a vast quantity of rain and hail. And the wind blew the rain in the face of the Canaanites, and so darkened their eyes that their arrows and slings were of no advantage to them, nor would the coldness of the air permit the soldiers to make use of their swords. While this storm did not so much incommode the Israelites because it came in their backs, they also took such courage upon the apprehension that God was assisting them, that they fell upon the very midst of their enemies and slew a great number of them, so that some of them fell by the Israelites, some fell by their own horses, which were put into disorder, and not a few were killed by their own chariots.
Okay, before we go on, if you compare this to the biblical account, so chapter 4 was rather sparse on details. These details seem to be, he has formed these details or this version of the story from the poetic account, right? Just this, this is for you, Richard. Do you know what this word means?
Do you want me to continue, Rabbi?
No, hold on. This is the weekly Stump Richard, the vocabulary expert. In Commode, I had to look it up.
Oh, I know what it means.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
It's not to make comfortable.
Right, or inconvenience, perhaps. Yeah, to
Right,
make, yeah. But there's a great word that you may want to use in Scrabble later on today when you get to your online Scrabble game.
Well, I thought it meant you were in the toilet.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That's great. Okay.
All right, Rabbi, I have a question about another word.
Sure.
Apprehension.
Yeah, used in a different way.
Totally.
Yeah. So the way it's used here is they understood, right? They apprehended. They caught on to, so to speak, right?
Yes, caught, to catch something.
right, good eye. Our vocabulary expert. You're the serious vocabulary expert. Richard is the vocabulary expert if you want to laugh. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so go ahead. Susie, now if you could go on to the rest.
At last, Sisera, as soon as he saw himself beaten, fled away and came to a woman whose name was Yael, a Kenite, who received him when he desired to be concealed. And when he asked for somewhat to drink, she gave him sour milk, of which he drank so immeasurably that he fell asleep. But when he was asleep, Yael took an iron nail and with a hammer drove it through his temples onto the floor. And when Barak came a little afterward, she showed Sisera nailed to the ground, and thus was the victory gained by a woman, as Deborah had foretold. Barak also fought with Jabin at Hazor, and when he met with him, he slew him. And when the general was fallen, Barak overthrew the city to the foundation and was the commander of the Israelites for 40 years.
So let's just look at this section from a form point of view. That is not the content as much as the form. How does Josephus end this chapter of history?
The 40 years is been used frequently before as I guess a measure of peace.
Right, and that's part of the biblical account at the end of chapter 5. And the land was tranquil 40 years. But unlike the biblical account, the chapter before the biblical account has the following. And on that day, God subdued King Yavin of Canaan before the Israelites. The hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Yavin of Canaan until they destroyed King Yavin of Canaan. What does Josephus add here at the end of his story?
Well, its focus is on Barak.
Exactly. Lest, boys and girls, you think that a woman, even though she prophesied that the enemy will fall at the hand of a woman, and that was kind of a trick, right, to get us to think something else about Devorah, but really it's about, lest you think that's how it formally, and I use formally because I used the word form before, formally, it's the men that did it, right? You have to end with, and that is actually a biblical format or form that I've pointed out many times that I learned from Yair Zakovich. And that is that very often the women are the main movers and shakers of a story, but formally you recognize the man. And that's the biblical way of being, not sneaky, there's a better word for it, but so for instance, Esther, even, the Book of Esther, I don't know what they called it originally when it was out, but not necessarily Esther, maybe they did, but how does the Book of Esther begin? Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, and it was in the days of the king Achashverosh. And how does it end? It ends with Mordechai. And the Book of Ruth, which is the main chapter is Ruth. The Book of Ruth begins with Vayhi bimei Shvot HaShoftim. It was in the days of the judges, and then it talks about Ruth, Naomi's husband and the two boys, and then it's all about the women. And at the end of the book, it's about David and his ancestors, how David was born to that line. So you've got this situation where the story is really about a woman, but formally we frame it about men. Did somebody want to say something beforehand?
Yes, I have a question, Rabbi.
Sure.
So presumably it ends with men because it's written by men. And so that raises the question to me, was any of this written by women? Is the middle section stories from women written by men, or is it actually written down by women, or do we know who actually did the writing? Okay,
so your question is multi-tiered because the first place to ask that question is about biblical writing itself, because we're now in post-biblical writing. This is Josephus, the end of the 5th century CE. He's writing, after this stuff was at least in oral form for 1,000 years. and written down at least for 500 years or whatever we date the final book of Judges. And so I would say, Michael, that it doesn't seem to me, and the teachers that I've studied with over the years, that any of that literature was written by women. It was all written by men. And sometimes the earlier version of a story is by a man who understood that the world doesn't revolve around the pupik of the navel of a man, but it includes the navel of women's as well. And I could have been more sexually explicit there. And yet an editor will come and kind of tame it down. A good example of that, Michael, would be the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad, the 5 daughters of Tzlofchad, who said to Moses, "It's not fair. Our father died, and he wasn't part of the bad guys. He just died on his own accord, and he doesn't get an inheritance because we're only 5 daughters." And so Moses goes and asks God. God says they're right. Benot Tzlofchad, right there, they're correct. And that's great story of a beginning of feminism, women's liberation. But at the end of the book of Numbers, it has those 5 daughters marrying their uncles, which essentially meant that all the land stayed where it was originally going to go. Right. So there's that battle going on, but I think it's between men who are more aware of the importance of women in society and men who wanted to stick with the male hegemony. Okay. Now we get to post-biblical literature. There could be stuff that was written by women. It doesn't feel like it to me. And I don't know if that's just my bias or the teachers I've studied with who have definitely, and many of them have been women as well, but of course in a different age. It was the 80s. If we were to study with some of the great female or feminist leading male Bible scholars today, which I'm not up on what's being, maybe there is some signs that people say, well, this was written by a woman. It was customary to say in the days that I was in studying academically Jewish literature that female literature came up, at least in Europe, with the tchinas, with the tchinot, these prayers that were written by women in Yiddish in the last, 400 years. I'm not an expert at it. And so that might be. So and then of course, the modern period, already in the 19th century, we've got women, Jewish writers. And again, not my expertise, but I think these sources, to answer your question, I think these are all sources written by men, in which, in this case, it's written by a man. We know who he was, Josephus, we know when he lived. And if this is him relating to us the biblical tradition about a woman, but also kind of saying, yes, but don't, just know formally it was Barak. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Is this the biblical source of Obama's first name?
I would guess so. I would guess,
Interesting.
Yeah, but I didn't. It's probably in his. I have the first autobiography. I bought it like when he was president. I never read it. It's on my shelf. I really ought to read it now. But yeah, I guess, but I don't know. And it could be used in. Well, this wouldn't be the reason, but I think Barakeh, somebody who knows Sashi, remember, I think was the name of Muhammad's horse. Does anybody remember that? Okay. I seem to have some memory about where he tied his horse, which made it a holy place before he was given a vision through the angel Gabriel on the Temple Mount. I don't know. Okay. Anything else on these two? So we go now we're in the early rabbinic period of Mechilta, a Midrash Tana'i, that is from the first few centuries of the Common Era. And so why don't we, who do I just don't have everybody's in mind. Scotty, why don't you read from Mechilta number 3?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Mechilta. Rabbi Nehemiah says, if one takes upon himself a single mitzvah in true faith, one is worthy of having the Holy Spirit repose upon them. And so we find with Moses, David, and Devorah that in the fullness of their faith, they chanted song and the Holy Spirit reposed upon them.
Okay, so this to me is not, it's not necessarily about Devorah, but because we don't have that many examples of characters, historic literary characters that come out with song. David is the most famous, Moses because of the Song of the Sea, but also Devorah. They wanted to say that this is not just them. It's not two things. I think the Mechilta Rabbi Nechabi wants to say. It's not this them singing songs or writing poems. It was done Baruch HaKodesh under as it's written here. The Hebrew here is Ruach HaKodesh with the Holy Spirit, right? It's been done. They've been moved by God to say these words. But what I think is noteworthy in this particular list, and we'll see in the second part of the Talmud now in the next section, is that Devorah is mentioned along with them. One could also mention Miriam. She has like a line, but it's a short section. Moses, David, and Devorah are the ones that have the big epic poems in biblical literature. Okay, and somebody asked me about other women who were prophets. I mean, you all know the status of women in Genesis that varies between each of the foremothers. They're there. We know about Miriam. And then we hear about a number of women who are challenging, especially if you grew up in the Christian tradition with the genealogy of Jesus in the first chapter of Matthew, in which you know about Tamar, or if you study with us in Genesis 38, who is not in touch with God so much, but she certainly usurps the sexual authority of her father-in-law. Rachav, the prostitute in Joshua, who helps the two spies out. Bathsheba with David. Ruth, who is a Moabitess, who really shouldn't be mixing with our people, yet does. So they don't say prophecies, right? They don't say something that people think was considered by the rabbis to be inspired directly from God, other than what we have here in the next source. Scotty, go ahead and read from the Bavli from Megillah.
Our rabbis taught 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses prophesied to Israel, and they neither took away from nor added anything to what is written in the Torah, save only the reading of the Megillah. So
that means, in other words, that there were prophets. In this case, I brought it because of the 7 prophetesses, but those prophecies did not usurp the Torah, right? This is not like Jesus afterwards, or it's not, which is not exactly usurpation, but or Muhammad, even though this was written before Muhammad. That idea that it supersedes, they didn't supersede. The only thing that was changed, only one thing was changed, and that's the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, which is an interesting thing. In all those books, they certainly influence the halachic tradition, the tradition of Jewish, the Jewish legal tradition as documented in the Talmud. They influence, the words from the prophets influence, but the only thing is really set up as considered to be a commandment is the reading of the Megillah. Okay, go ahead. Now we get to the section, which is why I brought this.
7 prophetesses. Who were these? Sarah, Miriam, Dvorah, Hannah, Abigail, Huldah, and Esther.
Okay, so briefly, Sarah, everybody knows, right? That's an easy one. Miriam, sister of Moses. We've done a lot of study about her. There's things that she says and is documented. That's fine. Dvorah, we just had. Who's Hannah, people? Anybody remember who Hannah is?
The mother of Samuel?
Exactly, right? And she's in touch. Remember, she has that conversation with God. She's praying with her lips silently, and the priest kind of makes fun of her, tells her she's drunk, she should get out of there. And of course, she devotes her son to God. So that's another example of a poem written by a woman, but for some reason, the Mechilta doesn't include her poem as those that were divinely inspired. Now, who's Abigail? Anybody?
It was daughter of Saul, wife of David. Is that it?
Yeah, so not a daughter of Saul, but one of the many wives of David.
Okay.
Easy to get confused. If you thought that David had only one wife, that would have been Michal, Bat Shaul.
Okay. Yeah.
But Abigail is the most active of his wives. She's the one whose husband refused to give protection money. You know what? You know, like when the gangsters come and you get paid to keep your place safe. That's called protection money, right? So David and his band of guerrillas, of warriors, they kind of went to him and said, "Listen, I need food. I need to restock with you." And he said no, and he was struck with what we would probably understand today as having a stroke. And he kind of still before he dies, and Abigail was his wife, and they get married, and she's the one who has a lot of wisdom. So I'm guessing she's mentioned here. I don't think there's a poem attributed to her, but because she's considered to be the most intellectually sophisticated of David's wives. And how about the next one, Huldah? Anybody know who that is? Heard that name before?
Rabbi, I have, and it has nothing to do with this context. Huldah was the name of an English artist who was very popular, unlike the French artists, during the Impressionist period. And her name was Huldah, Huldah. Same pronunciation. And you just think of, well, where would a name like that come from if it wasn't biblical in origin?
It comes from the Book of Kings. It's from the Book of Kings. We don't have any prophecies of her, not in the Torah, in the Book of Kings itself. And I haven't delved down into see if there's a lot of rabbinic literature about her. Perhaps when we get to the Book of Kings, we'll look into that. Okay, and of course Esther. So you could ask, why is Rebecca's not on this list? She talked to God. You could ask, a lot of things, but of course I only brought this because it mentions Devorah. And now go ahead, Scotty. We're on the top of everybody's on the screen. Go ahead.
Devorah, as it is written, now Devorah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidot, a woman of flame, Eshet Lapidot. What is meant by woman of flames?
Okay, beforehand, we read it as the wife. Our translation said the wife of Lapidot, and most people would say that's the simple meaning of the text. When it says in Hebrew, Eshet Lapidot, Eshet is the construct form of Isha, woman or wife. Eshet, wife of the next. So it's Sarah, Eshet Avraham, Sarah, the wife of Abraham. And here we understood Lapidot to be the name of her husband. But it also the word means flames. And you could also understand it as a woman of flames, because the construct is not just for a husband, a wife of a husband, particular husband, an Eshet Chayil, you know that, right? A woman of valor. A woman of something. So Lapidot or flames, that's what this tradition in the Talmud is playing around with in those words in the beginning of chapter 4. Go ahead. Why is she called? What is meant by?
What is meant by a woman of flames? Because she used to make wicks for the temple, and she sat under a palm tree. Why under a palm tree?
Before, Scotty, just a second. Before we go into she sat under, it's going to parse out the verses about her, because she's peculiar, unique. Why you've got this woman who's an essential figure here. So on Eshet Lapidot, the way they got around it was that she made wicks for the temple. Other rabbinic literature that I didn't bring here and going on to the Middle Ages loves to talk about that. And the truth is there's a competing tradition or a composite tradition that she made the wicks for the candles. And again, it could be projecting backwards when they already had wax candles or tallow candles, or it could be just the wicks themselves of the lamps. Doesn't matter now. She made the wicks, but according to some of the sources, Lapidot was her husband's name, and he was called Lapidot because he was kind of dull. He wasn't smart. He wasn't sophisticated, and she sent him to bring lamps to the temples. That was his job. He helped he schlepped lamps or supplied he was a supplier of light to the temple, and she made the wicks, and she made them extra thick so they would burn slow. And because of that, so it's conflated because somebody has taken that word, included her husband in it as well. But this particular source says it's only because she merited this special attention because she made wicks for the lights of the temple. You'll notice that men, when they're quoted as prophets, they don't necessarily need that special reason why. But a woman, of course, needs the reason why. And that does go to the sexism here. We go on with this verse, the next part of that verse. The next verse says, and she sat under Tomer Dvorah, a palm tree called Dvorah. Go ahead, Scotty.
Why under a palm tree? Rav Shimon ben Avishalom said, to avoid being alone together with another man. According to Rashi, because unlike other trees, the palm's branches do not offer any privacy to those sitting beneath it.
Okay, before we go on to, so why a palm tree? Why not a willow? Because willow trees, you know, especially weeping willows, but a willow tree or other kinds of trees that are bushy, she could be underneath there, and who knows what she might be doing with those guys. They're not allowed to, and you know, from Talmudic times already, a man is not allowed to be in a room with a woman who's not his wife. They're not allowed to be alone. That's called yichud. And it's terribly very detailed halachot. Can the door be open? Can it be unlocked? Does it apply to a woman when her husband is in town, or if her husband is out of town? Does it apply? All sorts of lovely details of this particular chapter of Jewish legal history. And here it's projected back onto that, and Rashi explains it for those that didn't understand it itself. Okay. Great. And then finally, another explanation.
Another explanation is, just as a palm tree has only one heart, so Israel in that generation had only one heart devoted to their Father in heaven.
And that's kind of typical to rabbinic literature. Starts with the Talmud. We're talking about this. Oh, you said this? Well, that means this, and this means this. And then somebody says, oh yeah, by the way, I know something else about this. And it's added on. And whether that was the original conversation happening in a, probably no, it's probably whoever kept adding on to this said, oh, I know one more thing about it. And that's how a Talmudic sugya, a passage, a paragraph of Talmud is often built. It's one thing glued on to the next. It's kind of stream of consciousness. And then, of course, in the Middle Ages, you see that on manuscripts themselves. Somebody's copying down a manuscript, and then the guy who's copying it down says, oh, wait a minute, I know something else. And he adds it in the margin. And then the next person who copies it puts it into the text itself. So that's how we get these very long composite texts. And that's what happened with Rashi. The original words of Rashi were much, scholars, at least the scholar who I think at the time knew the most when I was in school, Eliezer Twito, wrote that it's just a smaller part of Rashi, the thing that appears on all the manuscripts of Rashi, that's what Rashi actually wrote, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. But when you see in printed Chumashim, printed Torahs, or other versions of Rashi, things were added on to the end. Those were added on, he says, by the Tosafot, that is the disciples of Rashi, and we'll get to them in a second. Did I bring the wrong? No, I brought the right one. Okay. Okay, any questions or comments about that Talmudic passage we just did from Megillah? By the way, Megillah is about Purim and Esther. There's a lot of material about Esther there. And so it was a normal place for the rabbis, the editors of the Talmud, to add more discussions about women in the Bible. Anything else? I can't see hands, so just speak up. Okay, then. Richard, would you read number 5, Tana de Be'eliyahu Rabbah? This is another complicated or composite piece of literature from, I don't know, 10th century, maybe, something like that. And there's the big part of it and the little part of it. The teacher of the house of Eliyahu, of Elijah, and Rabbah means the big one, and there's a Zuta, the small one. Anyway, this is relatively, this is post-Talmudic. Okay, go ahead, Richard.
What is so special about Deborah that she was chosen as judge for Israel and prophet at that time, especially since Pinchas ben Lazar was around in those days? It is because whether Jew or non-Jew, man or woman, slave or maidservant, the divine spirit rests upon people, all according to their actions.
Okay, it's kind of, again, for me, it's not so much what he says, we'll talk about it in a second, but why does he even have to answer the question? Because lurking in the background are those men that are saying it's pasnish, it's not right, it's not proper that a woman should be like this. And I didn't bring some other sources. If you want to delve deeper into this, you can find online Louis Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews, but I don't know if it has the notes as well. But even his kind of rewriting of rabbinic literature, which some of you are familiar with, he'll explain that no, it's in the notes. So only if you have the notes. But there's a later source that really condemns Devorah for being immodest, because she shouldn't have been sitting out there judging the people. She should have been inside. And because she shouldn't have said to Barak, you know, you're going to be humiliated. And because she shouldn't have written a poem, which is basically about her. Right. So you can sense the uneasiness, the unease of men in the background. And that's in the background here. So what's so special about Devorah that she got to be a judge? Right. Why is that? And especially since there was another leader, there was a Kohen, the chief priest, was the grandson of Aaron, according to this and other traditions. Pinchas was still there. She shouldn't have been talking. And so, this is a powerful statement for a rabbinic source. It's Jew or non-Jew, that like Balaam, for instance, right? Or man or woman, or slave or maidservant. In that case, I'm thinking right now of second Book of Kings, chapter 5, which is a lovely story that includes a maidservant and a slave and a servant who know more than their masters, including who are prophets and kings. All right. So, and this, of course, was digested into what the Maimonides writes hundreds of years later, that the need to accept the truth from whoever says it. Statements or comments? Okay, Richard, why don't you do another one? This is now Tosafot. Tosafot mean the additional comments. And this is very often a spin on Rashi, on the Talmud, not on the Torah, not on biblical literature, but on Talmudic literature. And but it takes us into the 12th, 13th, maybe 12th, 13th centuries, I think. Go ahead.
Devorah judged in accordance with God's words to her. Alternatively, she was not a judge, but rather a teacher of the laws.
Here in the background, somebody saying, oh, Bemet, really? She was a judge, come now. Okay, she was just a teacher. And that reminds me of you know, it was probably in the Reform and Conservative movements until they started to ordain women. It was still at the time when I was in rabbinical school, the first woman in Israel in the Masorti movement, concerned movement, was ordained together with me in '93. It was quite a battle that we put on for that. But until then, of course, they could become teachers. They could be in a very similar program of rabbinical school. They just couldn't be ordained. And you still have that to a certain degree, although less so, in what's called open Orthodoxy or modern Orthodoxy in this country, where now you have women, they'll use very often, they won't use the term rabbi, or they'll use marat, which is Aramaic for teacher or master as well. And this kind of thing, well, they can do everything like rabbis, we just can't call them a rabbi. Yeah, so that's what this sounds like to me. Anybody?
Rabbi, can
Yes.
they perform rituals, marriages?
You're talking about now or then?
Now.
Now, Orthodox rabbis, you know, I think it depends on the particular rabbi. There is a program. Rabbi Avi Weiss in Riverdale was very instrumental in setting up that program. And you know what? I don't know the question. I don't know the answer. I don't know enough about it. Yeah, but it's a good question. Of course, you know, that's a modern thing, right? Rabbis performing these things. You may know that 200 years ago, you didn't need a rabbi. It was actually in the beginning of the 20th century, I think. I know of a particular document that was signed by 100 rabbis stating that only rabbis could do weddings on, and that was in Palestine, I think. That was pre-state Israel. And but according to Jewish law, you don't need a rabbi. That's influence from the church. It's done. It's even done in ultra-Orthodox circles, but it doesn't need to be a rabbi. What's important at a wedding to know in the examination whether a couple is really lawfully married or not is checking the witnesses. Were the witnesses there? Were they dependable? Are they kosher witnesses? And there's a lot of ways of defining that in Orthodox law. And was something given, not just a ring, or not necessarily a ring, but was something given at the right time. Those are the things that one checks, but it's never having to do with who was the rabbi. That's kind of influence of Christianity, the role that the rabbi plays. Another example of that is visiting the sick, chaplaincy. There was never a Jewish thing for a rabbi to be the person to visit the sick. That was borrowed from Christian circles, that where it was the clergy that ran the hospitals, right? It was the sisters of the order, hence the word achot or schwester, achot in Hebrew, which means sister, or schwester in German for nurse. In many languages, the word for nurse is from sister. That's from sister of the order, and that influenced Judaism in a different way. Not that the rabbis would do that. The rabbis were there to teach and to make halachic decisions. They would instead, there were what we call Chevra Kadisha, the holy societies, the ones that most of you know as the ones that take care of those who are dead, prepare them for burial society. And in Aramaic is Chevra Kadisha, the holy society. But a few hundred years ago, in many places in Europe, and I don't think this was the case outside of Europe, there were all sorts of holy societies, one for raising the money for brides for their dowry if they couldn't afford it, one for visiting the sick, one for saying psalms, one for bringing people in, feeding people. So yeah, just a little bit about how, yeah. So rabbis have always, so in that way, Tosafot is correct, right? The leaders have always been teacher of laws. But here, it's something rubbed in the wrong way to say, well, we shouldn't call her a judge. And he can get away with it because that term, shofet, in the Book of Judges is used in so many different ways. Okay. So Sandy, would you read from the Babylonian Talmud number 7?
I don't have it, Rabbi.
Oh, it's on the screen. Can you see the screen?
Oh, I'm on my phone. No, I can't.
Oh, okay. So go ahead, Dan. Would you read number 7?
Transgression for the sake of heaven is equivalent to a mitzvah not for its own sake. The proof is, as it is written, blessed above all women shall Yael be, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Above women in the tent she shall be blessed. And it is taught, who are these women in the tent? They are Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Yael's forbidden intercourse with Sisera for the sake of heaven is compared to the sexual intercourse in which the matriarchs engaged. How is it derived that Yael engaged in sexual intercourse with Sisera?
So you know what, I'll stop you here. Let's do the first paragraph first. It's a little bit complicated, okay? You've got this thing, what happens when you have to break a law for a good reason, right? Let's say Esther, okay? Esther, she's sleeping with a foreign man. She's probably not eating kosher food, but she's got to do it to save the Jewish people, right? That would be an example of a transgression for the sake of heaven. And that is equivalent to doing a mitzvah, not for its own sake. Now, a mitzvah for another, in other words, it's in a gray area. You're supposed to do a mitzvah, a commandment, for the right reason, because it's commanded. You're supposed to not do something because it's commanded. What if you do something that you're not supposed to do, even though it was commanded? Well, if it's for the sake of heaven, so that's another status. But you shouldn't think, says the Talmud, that that's so good. It's not more than, say, studying Torah or feeding the hungry just so that you become an important person, right? So there's this. It's kind of a scale or a spectrum of how many points you really get in heaven, right? Depending on your intentionality. And the proof of it is, for this particular statement, says the Talmud, this view of the Talmud, is from the fact that the Talmud, the Book of Judges says, blessed above women shall be Yael, shall Yael be, and above women in the tent. And so the answer, the question in the Talmudic, in the Beit Midrash, in the study house was, what women in the tent? Who else? There's nobody else there. What is he talking about? So that's why they come and say, oh, that means all those women's in the tent, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, because they were wandering, right? They weren't in houses, they were in tents. They weren't in royal palaces. And then it says, so, and why is it compared here? So Yael's forbidden intercourse is compared to the sexual intercourse which the matriarchs engaged. So in other words, it's a way of bringing Yael in, it's a way of bringing Yael in comparison with the holy matriarchs. And then, by the way, somebody says, whoa. What kind of sexual intercourse are you talking about? In chapter 4, she merely gives him to drink, he falls asleep, she smashes his head. In chapter 5, you'll remember that there was a business about, well, she fell between his legs she fell. There's quite an emphasis on between his legs, which I shared with you last week, is that what Zakovich says is definitely the way of the biblical text telling us that this was probably a case of rape. That was the original tradition. She was raped. That's in the background here. Now you can go ahead.
As Rabbi Yochanan said, that wicked one, Sisera, engaged in 7 acts of sexual intercourse with Yael at that time. As it is stated, between her feet, he sunk, he fell, he lay. Between her feet, he sunk, he fell. Where he sunk, there he fell down dead. Each mention of falling is referring to another act of intercourse. But Yael at least enjoyed the sexual intercourse with him. Why is the verse so effusive in her praise? Rabbi Yochanan said, all the good of the wicked, that is, anything good received from wicked people, is nothing other than evil for the righteous, and therefore she certainly derived no pleasure from the act.
Don't you love this? These two guys in their setting of men talking about this, this horrible case. You couldn't imagine it being something other than rape, really, if you look at the text. Here's this man, as we said last week, this defeated enemy, this defeated general, warrior. So what's he going to do? He takes it out on women, something that we've seen around the world, unfortunately. And these two guys in the rabbinic times are debating exactly, well, wait a minute, should she get credit, not get credit? First of all, I make note of the fact that they're very sensitive to the text. It says so many times where he fell, he lay, she sunk, he fell, all this kind of things. So 7 times, they went at it 7 times. Well, I could understand somebody saying, yeah, he raped her 7 times. He kept doing that. It was so horrible, so evil. But instead, some schmuck, and I'll call him for who he is, the Stama de Gemara, the narrator of the Talmud, the editor, says, well, at least she enjoyed it, right? At least she enjoyed it. Oh, horrible stuff, right? And then Rabbi Yochanan kind of saves the day. You should know, the fact that she didn't enjoy it. Anything a righteous person gets from somebody wicked, they have no enjoyment from it. So Rabbi Yochanan saves the day, but kind of saves the day. If he had said, shut the hell up, you're so insensitive, the kind of things we would say today, right? So that's my impassioned reaction. How about you folks? How do you see this?
The only question I would have is, where in this is some idea that she was enjoying it? That's my question.
There's an assumption of a male assumption that even though a woman was raped, she must have enjoyed it. I mean, think of all the horrible things you've seen in movies and TV and you know about life and literature, where there's a male is imposing his will on a female and saying, you want it, right? You like it, right? This kind of horrible, horrible brutality and bullying. We see that all over, right? Do you see that, what I'm saying, Alan?
Yes. All right. Now I do. Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Well, at the end of the first paragraph, they say Yael's forbidden intercourse. And does that mean forbidden in the sense that he should not have had intercourse with her, or she shouldn't have had intercourse with him? And then they're comparing it to consensual intercourse between the matriarchs and their husbands. So that seems pretty off for me too.
Yeah, so the whole thing here is it's multiple traditions that have been woven together. So we can't, if the question was about, it seems inconsistent. I know it. I know at the foundation of your question is a lot of this is yucky, right? That I understand, and that we agree with, and it's important for us to see this and not to say, well, that was then and now is now, because still for many people, now is now, right? This is now as well, unfortunately. But if we can't look for consistency and coherence on the page of the Talmud, because it's a patchwork of different voices from the past. And while there was the final editor of a particular section of the Talmud who had an idea of what it should be, I would like to say that in some cases the idea was, look how many different voices. Look at the pluralism. I know I'm speaking in modern terms. Look at the pluralism, plurality of voices in our own tradition. In the end, the proof will be in the pudding, right? And the proof in the pudding is one way. How do halachic decision makers, what's the final word that they have about a particular way of life? And the second is if we do have descriptions. I mean, in this case, now we go back to Michael's question about the women right. It's pretty clear here that a woman did not write this section, correct? I think we all agree.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and read from Leviticus Rabbah?
Rabbi,
Yes.
did women ever become sophers?
Only in modern times. You mean like a scribe, a Torah scribe?
Yeah,
In modern times, in the last few decades.
right. But not in ancient times.
No, I don't think so, no.
They weren't kosher enough, huh?
No, I don't know if they're not kosher as much as they weren't, well, there's a few things going on. One, there might be a discussion about it. There is a discussion about it, I think. Yeah, of course there's a discussion about it. If they're not obliged to do a mitzvah, then they're not, they can't enable somebody else to do that mitzvah. So if a woman, what's an example? So if they're not obliged to put on tefillin, for instance, which women are not obliged because it's a time governed commandment or a positive commandment governed by time, and it's not one of the exceptions, then a woman can't write tefillin because she's not obliged to that. But others would say, well, but she is obliged to hear the Megillah, so a woman could write the Megillah Esther. So there halakhically it would be possible, but from a social point of view, I don't think it really happened. And I think that women didn't necessarily read and write in a lot of places around the Jewish world for the last 2,000 years, or at least until, relative to the last few centuries. Okay?
Yeah, so that talking about Devorah being a judge would mean that she was literate and she could judge because she could write and read a complaint or decide an issue.
So decide, yes, not necessarily write or read because it could have all been oral.
Oh, okay.
Right. But again, those are details about what really happened. I don't know what's clear though is that Devorah is an exception to the rule, which proves the rule. If you saw beforehand, I was just reading about this, the candidate to be a brigadier general, the African-American brigadier general in the Marines, who's being brought to Senate today or sometime soon. And the fact that in the history of the Marines, there's been, so few African-American generals in the years since they've allowed blacks into the Marines. But if you look here, I was reminded that there were 48 prophets, right? And 7 of them were 7 were 48 men and 7 women, right? That's far from the 50-50. So I think all these exceptions prove the rule that, and in all those we don't have a book. The fact that we don't have what Huldah said, we only have the fact that she prophesied during the time of a particular king. Okay, so go ahead. I forgot who was reading.
I was, but they're a new section.
Eileen, do you want to read from Leviticus Rabbah, please?
Sure. Resh Lakish said, "We have gone over the entire Bible and have not found the word semicha spelled with a sin, not samech. So what is semicha? Shemi, ko Shemi, my name, testifies to the fact that this wicked man did not lay a hand on her."
Okay, so Rish Lakish, right, Talmud, it says, looking over, and they found the word smicha, which is blanket, is spelled wrong. Now, the fact of the matter is a sin and a samech, those two letters, they interchange sometimes and they get mixed up. But he says, I didn't find it anywhere else. So what does it mean? It must not mean, it must not mean blanket, that she covered him, but rather he breaks it down into Shmi, that's God saying, in my name, Ko, that in my name, so, and what was the so? In my name, says God, testifies the fact that he did not lay a hand on her. In other words, Rish Lakish wants to keep the idea of Yael as a hero as pristine. No, in other words, this is an answer to the rabbis who would say, well, you know, she seduced him, or maybe the original story, she seduced him. She got him drunk, she seduced him so that she could kill him, which is not that different than the Esther story, not a huge jump from the Esther story, different from the Judith story, but not that different. Same idea, that was the assumption that she's going to try to entice him into getting drunk so she could cut off his head, Holofernes. But so here he says, no, don't even think about it. That the way that text is written with a misspelled word, we understand from the misspelled word, instead of reading semicha, we should read shmicha or shmicho, right? My name, God, that's God speaking, she did nothing wrong. We want to keep her pristine, which is also a sexist issue, of course, right? Men can do all sorts of things and sully themselves, but the men want the women to remain pure. Okay, why don't you go ahead and read another one. And this is interesting. This is literature that has to do with the arguments between Jews and Christians. And I don't know enough about Duran. I remember here and there. I need to look it up. Maybe one of you look it up. Algeria. Why a rabbi? Unless I got the wrong Rashbash. I mean, any case, I think this is from the literature of what's called Vikuach literature, the debate, the polemics between Jews and Christians. But whatever it is, it's an interesting way, again, of looking at this. Go ahead, Eileen, number 9.
The combination of such foods with the exhaustion of travel and the sight of a beautiful woman will lead to an emission. In his thoughts, he had relations with her, and that is to what this passage refers. The intent of this righteous woman was to weaken him so that she could kill him. This is called a sin with good intent, because she allowed him to stare at her so that he would have a discharge and be weakened. This is the meaning of this passage, and not that this righteous woman literally slept with this wicked man.
So another way, right, a thousand years later, of twisting it to make sure that you shouldn't think, which is interesting because Yael's not even a Hebrew, right? She's belongs to the Kenites, right? They're allies, but somebody needed to keep her pure, or many men needed to keep her. So basically, in his head, he thought he slept with her, right? But he was all in his pants, right? Between his head and his pants, had nothing to do with her. So, and I know that you guys like a juicy source like that, but let's just go to last two pictures. We're spilling over. There are so many pictures, so many illustrations of this in around. I just picked two that seem to be, to me, I like the fact, and you also get, exactly, was it iron, was it wood, there's a lot of changes in the details, which probably have to do with translations of words and in Josephus, I think it's just the way that, and I didn't look at the Greek. What is the Greek and how was it translated in English by the person that translated him 100 years ago, whenever it was. But here's one that I like the fact that she's walked. It's not her tent, it's her house, very solid house, and she's very she's dressed for any good 13th century stake pounding into the head scene. Okay, I like the blood on the ground. Then this is the more classical one, right? And I brought this particular one because in Wikipedia, this art, first of all, she's a female artist, which I don't know much about art, right? But I think that's kind of noteworthy. And she began painting when she was 16, and you got to wonder what happened to her in her life, right? That this is one of her pictures. Yeah, one of her paintings. And that's it. Questions, comments?
David,
Yeah.
this is going back to the question that's just dawned on me about Barack Obama's first name.
Uh-huh.
I'm quite sure it's not from the biblical figure Barak. He said his name, I heard him interviewed, means like blessing. I think it's like Arabic form from Baruch.
Absolutely. Of course. Yes, of course. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Barak is what would be in Hebrew Barach. Yes, absolutely. Of course. Well, it's a good thing we've got somebody from Washington, D.C. on this call. The Or Hamidbar political advisor.
Inside the Beltway.
Inside the Beltway. It's all about the Beltway, folks. It's all about inside the Beltway. Okay. Anybody else?
Rabbi, this is more fun than most.
Yeah, so you mean you like this better than those passages from Leviticus about purity and impurity?
No, I think, when we do our Wednesday class, it's pretty dry. This has all kinds of interesting implications.
Well, we're going to get to some action.
Yeah.
We'll get to some action, not so sexual, but we'll get to some action later on in Numbers. Some of the stories are quite colorful. And, Roberta, what can I say? You came late to the game. We did Genesis, and we did a lot of that stuff in Genesis.
Sorry.
Genesis is dripping with it. Okay, anybody else, folks?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Sure.
According to Christianity, if a man looks at a woman with lust, it is considered that he has already committed adultery in his heart.
That was Jimmy Carter who made that comment famous.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So
yes.
That's in a lot of religions. It's certainly in Judaism. It's not biblical per se, although
No, he was quoting Jesus.
Yeah, no, I'm saying.
Yes.
Carter was quoting Jesus. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's not in the Torah. What I meant to say.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to covet your neighbor's wife, but the looking at another, even looking at the clothes of another woman, a woman who's not your wife, hanging out to dry, is considered to be sinful in Jewish law and Talmudic law. So we have it as well, and I'm guessing it's there in Islam even more so, which explains the amount of modesty demanded by some parts of Islam of women's dress, right? Apropos that, I remember when I was in Qatar, and David, I think I have a memory of us talking about this once. David Friedman, who's been in Qatar as well. I remember I needed a charger. My charger died, or I forgot it or something. So the guy who organized the conference sent me with a car, especially to a shopping mall, car and a bodyguard to the shopping mall, that I should go find one. I'm going up the aisle and I see these stores and all the women there, of course, with fully covered. And I see these stores with women like looking at dresses and stuff, like, short skirts and things like that. And so I said to the bodyguard, I said, I don't understand. Why are they buying those clothes? And he said to me, what do you mean you don't understand? We want to look at our women at home. When they're home, they come at home, they dress in ways that we find appealing. And it hadn't occurred to me that, that of course it's only that others don't see, which is like the same thing in the Jewish practice of women covering their hair. The husband, the children, the parents can always see their hair. It's just not other men. So it's out there, Rita Claire. The weakness of men is prevalent in all faith traditions. guessing. Okay. So listen, folks, I've been thinking because I thought I could get away with being away and also teaching, and I just see that so many things have been going on. I'm slipping and not as prepared as I'd like to be. So I'm going to ask your forgiveness and not teach. I was going to teach through the time, but not teach next week and the week after. The week after we'll be traveling in any case, hopefully back, unless I don't go, unless that my flight is canceled on Sunday, but hopefully I'm leaving on Sunday. And so I request your permission and your forgiveness that we skip weeks, and that'll be for both classes. And that way I can, in the short time I'll be in Israel, I can fully focus on our daughters and our grandchildren. Okay.
Good to
Have a
good
good
to
trip.
see.
Safe travels.
Enjoy, everybody.
Enjoy.
Okay, David Goldstein will be leading Kabbalat Shabbat this Friday, but I'll be with you Shabbat morning for the prayer and study. And I'm still here until Sunday. If anybody has any issues or something, I'm available. Okay, and even when I'm in Israel, you know that you can reach me by phone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Everybody. Thank you.
Travel safely.
Have fun.
Have a wonderful trip.
Thanks.
Hopefully you'll get to go soon.
Okay, see you soon, Sasha.
Yeah, we had a request for Sasha having more involvement on Friday night. So there, Rabbi.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, noted. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
We like
Bye-bye.
the women. We like the women.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye now.